today is July 15th, and it is the new moon of the 4th month. And I'm looking forward to getting into our topic. So let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for loving us and for correcting us and for guiding us and really being the parents that we need you to be. We have been wayward children all of our lives, and we know that those before us have been wayward, going back many generations. Please help us to finally get these simple lessons that you have been trying to teach us for so many years. And thank you so much for your promise to not leave us without fresh fruit to feed upon. Please help us to really get the message today. And thank you so much for giving it to us. Heavenly Family, please help me to deliver this message with clarity. Thank you. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen. Okay, so this new moon message is actually very much so connected to everything else we've gone through this year so far. And just as a brief refresher, we have been looking at a series of connected subjects dealing with the character of our Heavenly Family and its relationship to the historical Jesus and the knowledge of God and the Exodus and animal sacrifice and different things like that. So it's quite a series of connected subjects, and I'm not going to recap it really in much more detail than that because, as you all know, a recap can take a lot of time, and we already have so much that we need to cover. I will, though, briefly reference the most recent things that we have really looked at, and that is particularly in relation to Jesus and Jeremiah and animal sacrifice. And what we found is that the historical Jesus and the historical Jeremiah actually opposed animal sacrifice. And this, of course, can seem very shocking in light of the biblical canon, whichever biblical canon one subscribes to, simply because, well, we're all used to the Pentateuch in particular and its heavy focus on animal sacrifice and even portraying Yahweh as being pleased with animal sacrifice. And what we saw in recent studies is that Jesus' action in the temple, commonly referred to as the cleansing of the temple, was actually an action which was heavily influenced by Jeremiah's action and message recorded in Jeremiah chapter 7. And Jeremiah 7 explicitly rejects animal sacrifice. That's not the only passage in Jeremiah, but Jeremiah 7 certainly does so, and it denies the idea that Yahweh gave commands or instructions regarding animal sacrifice during the Exodus experience, and it denies sacrifice in connection with the Exodus for the purpose of saying, hey, eat your burnt offerings with your sacrifices, for I did not give these commands when I brought your ancestors from Egypt. And it's kind of saying, look, this is not what I ever desired. This is not what I want. I'm not going to participate with you in this sacrificial system. Therefore, if you want to do it yourselves, but I don't stand by you in doing this. So that's really a focus of Jeremiah. And yes, indeed, in the book of Jeremiah as we now have it, there are certainly passages which seem to be, and indeed are, in favor of animal sacrifice. However, as we have seen, those passages are really the result of a de-radicalization of Jeremiah's message, which is really quite evident and apparent through manuscript testimony and also through a careful examination of the text as we went through it in previous studies. In other words, the historical Jeremiah really was opposed to animal sacrifice, though his message was later adapted in order to make it less antagonistic to animal sacrifice. Because, of course, the majority of Israelites were pro-animal sacrifice, and the ruling establishment was pro-animal sacrifice. Yet, they all recognized that Jeremiah was a true prophet because his prophecies undeniably came to pass, and his counsel was undeniably true. And that was the case. It was undeniable because of the fact that they didn't follow his counsel, and it went really, really badly, especially for those who didn't. For those who did, the few who did, they had a lot better of circumstances. And his prophecies came true specifically in regard to the destruction of the temple and the Jewish people. And, all said and done, it really couldn't be denied after the exile that Jeremiah was a true prophet. It was beyond deniability at that point. So they had to maintain this acceptance of Jeremiah, at least in voice, but there were these elements of Jeremiah's message that were just too radical, so they were de-radicalized. The same sort of thing happened with Jesus. We found that really the only explanation of Jesus' action in the temple that makes sense of all the facts is that it was a protest of sacrifice, a protest of immorality, and a prediction of the destruction of the temple. Again, I won't go into all the details in this meeting as to why we can know that that is the case, but this is just a refresher that we've really gone through quite a lot to demonstrate that that is in fact the case. And we also saw a whole series of, or I'll say we saw a thread of testimony throughout the writings of the Nazarenes that is pro-vegetarian and that is anti-sacrifice. Now, yes, there are contrary threads within early Nazarene writings. But again, you have to ask yourselves, historically, what is the most likely scenario? And not just, intuitively, but given the historical data that we have, given the sources and their reliability, and also the date of sources and so on and so forth, what is more likely that Jesus and his earliest disciples were opposed to animal sacrifice and that people de-radicalized that message, or that they were in favor of it and later people radicalized it to add that sort of opposition. And I would say that Jesus' action in the temple is one of the main things that really brings the opposition to animal sacrifice all the way back to the historical Jesus. And again, the testimony that we have regarding that event really shows that Jesus was heavily influenced by Jeremiah in bringing about this action. And other events for which we have ample testimony in Jesus' life, for instance, the Last Supper, also are very clearly evidenced to be influenced by Jeremiah's teaching. Now, in this meeting, what we want to go through is, well, I guess I can't, at this point at least, kind of coherently summarize all of what we are going to go through. But we are going to start with looking at the fact that this line of thinking is not something that is exclusive to Jesus and the Nazarenes on one hand and Jeremiah on the other. It's not just a Jeremiah-Jesus thing. This is something which is present throughout the writings of at least some of the prophets, in addition to Jeremiah and Jesus, not just in the prophetic writings as well. There's at least one psalm that expresses a similar perspective. So first, I just want to mention that we need to keep in mind the historical timeline of Israel. And again, what we have imagined as the historical timeline, some aspects of it may need to be revised. But generally, I think we all understand some of the basics of the history of Israel. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the basics of the history of Israel, I really recommend that you do a little bit of research to become familiar with it, because it's really important. For example, if you don't know who came first, David or Hosea, I think it's important to find out and to get a grasp of, in what century did David live? In what century did Jeremiah live? In what century did Ezekiel live? And Amos and, all these various prophets. I think it's important to get a grasp of these things, because everything only makes sense within its proper context. Anything can only be understood correctly within its proper context. So the events of the 7th century were really brought about through the events of the 8th century, the prior century. In other words, the present is always formed by the past. And when we are looking at the past from our perspective, at whatever point we are looking, it was formed by the events of its past. So we need to keep this in mind. And I want to look at some of the ideas that are present in ancient Israel even before Jeremiah, because in our recent studies on Jeremiah clearly opposes animal sacrifice. He's not opposed to the temple overall, but he looks at the priesthood as being corrupted, and he views animal sacrifice as being a corruption of the priesthood. And in looking at it as we have so far, that kind of appears out of the blue, like, whoa, Jeremiah is totally revolutionary and radical in bringing this about. Now, it was radical within his context. However, I will say that it's not without precedent, because some of the prophets prior to Jeremiah expressed similar things. And we will take a look at that. So Jeremiah, he had his prophetic career at the end of the 7th century, going into the beginning of the 6th century. And so, according to the book of Jeremiah, his ministry started in the year 627 and lasted until at least into the 580s, because he was still doing something even after the destruction of the temple in 586. So that gives us a little bit of the time span of Jeremiah. And if you go back even 100 years, you'll find that there were prophets who had a similar message. So Micah is a prophet who lived about 100 years before Jeremiah, and his message was, again, somewhat similar. So we'll look a little bit at what Micah had to say, and also at what Amos had to say. And Amos, he prophesied even before Micah. And we'll look at another thing in the Psalms, Psalm 51. We'll take a look at that as well, and then move from there to a few other things. But one thing that I want us to take note of is that throughout these prophets, there is a heavy focus on morality, and then there's an opposition to animal sacrifice that is kind of interwoven with that. And part of the idea that's present in these prophets is the same sort of thing that we've previously seen in Jeremiah. He was pointing out that here they were thinking that they could go to the temple and offer sacrifice and be viewed as righteous in the eyes of God, as though the sacrifice was worth something. And Jeremiah clearly opposed that and said, look, it's not about offering sacrifices, it's about doing what is right. It's about changing your heart, circumcising the foreskin of your heart. And, he gave all these different analogies for changing our hearts and changing our way of thinking in order to do what is right. So ultimately, what the prophets were doing, this is true of Jeremiah, it's true of Amos, it's true of Micah, it's true of Hosea, they were seeking to discredit an incorrect system of morality and an incorrect view of how to deal with immorality. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise to us because we've talked about how really that's the message of our heavenly family all along. But I think we are now able to see it more clearly than we ever have before. The system of morality which the prophets rebuked was the one in which people thought that they could go about sinning and then bring a sacrifice to Yahweh, and that really, they had, in their sin, they had incurred guilt, and now they needed to get rid of that guilt because otherwise they were going to be punished. So really, it was about having Yahweh no longer angry at them so that they would not be punished for their sins. And they felt that, punishment needed to happen, so instead of that punishment happening on them, they were going to satisfy the wrath of God by bringing that punishment on an animal. So they would transfer their guilt to an animal, and then they would kill the animal, and they thought that God would then be pleased with them because of that. The prophets absolutely rejected that. And they were saying, look, these things do not make you right in the eyes of God. God despises your sacrifice. Instead, you need to do what is right. So first, let's focus a little bit on Amos, since Amos actually came first out of these prophets. Amos is understood to be the earliest of the 8th century prophets, and he probably bore his message sometime between 783 and 746 BCE. Now, we don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly how long he bore his message, but these dates are derived from the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah, in whose reigns Amos bore his message. So sometime within that span of years, but again, it may have been only a short period of time within that. So first, I want to read a few passages showing Amos's primary concern for morality. Amos 2, verses 6 and 7. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for money and the poor for a pair of sandals. Those who trample the heads of the powerless into the dust of the ground and turn aside the way of the destitute. A man and his father have sexual relations with the same girl, so that they profane my holy name. Amos 5, verse 10. They hate the one who reproves in the gate, and they abhor the one who speaks the truth. Again, these are rebukes, and you can see the nature of the rebukes. It's, look, you are doing bad things to each other, and you are despising the truth. I'll read another passage. Amos 5, verses 12 to 15. For I know how many are your transgressions, and how great are your sins. You who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe, and push aside the needy in the gate. Therefore, the prudent will keep silent in such a time, for it is an evil time. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so Yahweh, the God of hosts, will be with you, just as you have said. Hate evil and love good, and establish righteousness in the gate. It may be that Yahweh, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. And then Amos 5:24. But let righteousness roll on like the waters, and righteousness or justice like an ever-flowing stream. So there's this predominant focus, and I'm not reading everything through Amos, but these are just some examples to show how really the message of Amos was about moral uprightness. And that this moral uprightness was really focused on behaving correctly to each other and loving truth. Now, there are several instances throughout Amos where there are rebukes upon people for doing different types of sacrifices and things like that. And some of those objections could at least be interpreted as opposing incorrect sacrifice, not just sacrifice in general. For example, Amos bore much of his message, or really most of his message, to the northern kingdom. He was a prophet from Judah who bore his message to the northern kingdom. And he opposes sacrificing that was done in Bethel and Gilgal. And some might say that he opposed sacrifice there because it was done there. That is a possible interpretation. However, I will say that there is not one positive word toward animal sacrifice throughout all of Amos. And none of his opposition to any of the sacrifice is really specific to a type of sacrifice. It seems kind of more general. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it may be the case that the centralization of worship in Jerusalem is really something that came about after the time of Amos, because the sources that talk about this centralization of worship really come mostly from like the late 8th century and early 7th century BC, or even late 7th century, whereas Amos was writing in the early to mid 8th century BC, which is before our sources on the centralization of worship. And I know some scholars think that the centralization of worship in Jerusalem took place in the days of Hezekiah, which was after the ministry of Amos. Also, we have in the kind of historical writings of Israel, like Kings and Chronicles and that sort of thing, prophets are described as offering sacrifices and worshiping all over the place, in the northern kingdom, in the southern kingdom, and didn't appear to be an issue. And so it may be that worship was not necessarily supposed to be centralized in Jerusalem during the time of Amos, in which case he may be actually just opposing sacrifice in those passages. But there's one passage in particular in Amos which seems most clearly to oppose sacrifice. And again, it's important to keep in mind that there is not one positive word concerning animal sacrifice in Amos, no matter how you look at it. So we'll read now Amos 5, verses 21 to 27. And this is Amos quoting Yahweh. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your assemblies. Whatever you sacrifice to me, your burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, and I will not look at the fellowship offering of your fattened animals. Remove from me the noise of your songs, and I do not want to hear the melody of your harps. But let justice roll on like the water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Did you bring to me sacrifices and offerings those 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? And you will take up Sekuth, your king. Sekuth is the name of a foreign god, an Assyrian god. And Kaiwan, also an Assyrian god. And Kaiwan, your images, the star of your gods which you made for yourselves. And I will deport you beyond Damascus, says Yahweh. The God of hosts is his name. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that the tradition in Jeremiah 7, verses 21 and 22, which says that Yahweh did not give sacrificial commands during the Exodus experience. Again, that's a tradition in Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is from the late 7th century and early 6th century BCE. Now, this is like from 150 years earlier in Amos. And Amos also has this tradition that during the Exodus experience, there were no sacrifices or offerings. It says, did you bring to me sacrifices and offerings those 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? So there's a few things to learn from this. One thing is that here in the early to mid 8th century BCE, Amos has the idea that there were not actually sacrifices and offerings brought to Yahweh by the house of Israel during their 40 years of wilderness wandering. Again, it's posed as a question, but within the context of opposing their sacrifice, it's obvious that he's saying, look, here you are bringing your sacrifices to me right now, thinking that I'll be pleased with it, but did you bring sacrifices to me in the 40 years of wandering? You know, obviously the answer is supposed to be like, well, no, we didn't, so why do you think you need to bring them now? So that's one thing to learn, that this tradition that we find in Jeremiah 7 predates Jeremiah by at least 150 years. And another thing that we learn from this is that really the point of objection here is the sacrifice. Now, it does mention, I hate your festivals and your assemblies, and I don't want to hear the noise of your songs, the melody of your harps. But then it doesn't say, did you bring your sacrifices to me, and did you celebrate festivals, and did you sing during the 40 years of wilderness wandering? No, it's just focused on the sacrifice. So the idea is that these other things, the festivals and the songs, etc., have been polluted by the sacrificing. Also, this sort of thing is apparent throughout the other prophets. Same thing in Jeremiah. Jeremiah didn't oppose the temple as a whole, just like Jesus didn't oppose the temple as a whole. But the temple was being polluted by these sacrifices. Jeremiah didn't oppose song as a whole. In fact, Jeremiah was mostly giving his prophecies in song, in poetry, in this artistic form. Same thing with Amos. It's mostly done in basically Hebrew song. So it's not opposing these things as a whole, just like Jeremiah doesn't oppose festivals as a whole, nor does Amos, but these things are viewed as being corrupted by the sacrifice of animals. So this is kind of an interesting thing, how this appears within Amos, again, 150 years before Jeremiah. So however radical Jeremiah was in his own day, what he said has precedent from years before. Just like us teaching materialism today is very radical in our day, though it has precedent 150 years before us in the early days of the Advent movement. Now, this idea of no sacrifice during the Exodus, and even vegetarianism during the Exodus, is something which has precedent even 150 years before Amos in some of our earliest sources on the Exodus. And for this, we can actually go to the Pentateuch, because while the Pentateuch does contain so much promoting animal sacrifice, it also does contain some passages which imply that there wasn't really a sacrificial system happening, at least not any large-scale sacrificial system. And for this, we'll look at two passages, one from the J source and one from the E source. The first one from the J source is the one that is less explicit. It is in Exodus 16, verses 4 and 5, and then skipping to verse 35b. Now, that's skipping in the combined Pentateuch, but really in the J source, it reads straight through from one to the other. So I'll read the passage now. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Here I'm raining bread from the skies for you, and let the people go out and gather the daily ration in its day in order that I can test them. Will they go by my instruction or not? And it will be that on the 6th day they will prepare what they bring in, and it will be twice as much as they'll gather on regular days." They ate the manna until they came to the edge of the land of Canaan. Okay, so this is a J passage, and it's not so specific about sacrifice one way or the other, but I will say that J does not talk about the tabernacle at all. And J does not talk about the institution of a sacrificial system at the Exodus. J does have animal sacrifice. All the way back from the days of the patriarchs, from Noah onward, there is sacrifice in J, and it presents it as a positive thing. So I'm not trying to say that J is anti-animal sacrifice or anything like that. No, J views Yahweh as pleased with sacrifice. However, it is interesting that it does not institute any sort of sacrificial system in connection with the Exodus, and it describes the Israelites as eating manna for 40 years in the wilderness. Like I said, this is the less explicit of the two. The other one is in the E source, and this is contained in Numbers 11. The E source also does not have a sacrificial institution in the Exodus experience. Again, J and E are two earliest main sources of the Pentateuch. They were written perhaps as early as the 10th century, or at least the 9th century. So both of them have a very early stage of biblical Hebrew, possibly written in the late 10th century, but it could also be in the 9th century. Some would say even in the 8th century. In any case, very early sources, and Richard Elliott Friedman argues that J is the earliest instance of prose history writing ever in the world, like on record. So kind of interesting. He views it as being from the 10th century BCE, and it would be from the late 10th century, not early 10th century. Anyway, Numbers 11. And the people were like grumblers, bad in Yahweh's ears. And Yahweh heard, and his anger flared, and a fire of Yahweh burned among them and consumed at the edge of the camp. And the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to Yahweh, and the fire subsided. And he called that place's name Taberah, because a fire of Yahweh burned among them. And the gathered mass who were among them had a longing desire, or a craving. And the children of Israel as well went back and cried, and they said, who will feed us flesh? Now, some translations will say meat, and meat is okay, but so often, for example, in the King James, the word meat is used just for food, but in Hebrew, the word is talking about animal flesh. It's talking about actual flesh, not just food in general. So they're coming and complaining and saying, who will feed us flesh? We remember the fish that we would eat in Egypt for free, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leek and the onions and the garlic. Now, obviously, those latter items are not flesh, but as you'll see, the predominant complaint throughout this passage is about flesh. So they're complaining, where's the flesh? Where's all these other things? And now our soul is dried up. There isn't anything except the manna before our eyes. Now notice here you have the children of Israel complaining, saying, we want flesh to eat. There isn't anything for us to eat except the manna. Now this is a little bit odd if, as you know, when you read the Pentateuch as it currently is, we just got through reading a whole bunch of stuff in Leviticus, which is actually saying that they were already doing the sacrificial system in the wilderness, and that they were sacrificing animals, and many of the sacrifices, most of the types of sacrifices, in fact, were actually eaten by priests, and some of them by people as well. So people, priests, they're all eating these animals if they're, having this sacrificial system instituted. So really, in the ancient world, if someone wanted to eat animal flesh, well, they would go sacrifice an animal. And in some of these sources in the Pentateuch, when it describes them coming out of Egypt, it describes them coming out with a whole bunch of animals. So why is it that they're here complaining, saying, there isn't anything except manna before our eyes, feed us flesh? Well, couldn't they just take their animals and go and sacrifice and eat them, offer a thank offering to Yahweh, as it says in Leviticus? Well, again, that's the P source. But here in the E source, we have a different tradition, a tradition which is actually saying that the only food they had to eat was manna. Continuing on, Numbers 11, verse 7. And the manna, it was like a seed of coriander, and its appearance was like the appearance of bdellium. The people went around and collected and ground it in mills, or pounded it in a mortar and cooked it in a pot and made it into cakes. And its taste was like the taste of something creamy made with oil. And when the dew descended on the camp at night, the manna would descend on it. And Moses gathered the people, crying by their families, each at his tent entrance. And Yahweh's anger flared very much, and it was bad in Moses' eyes. And Moses said to Yahweh, why have you done bad to your servant? And why have I not found favor in your eyes to set the burden of this entire people on me? In other words, he's unhappy that, hey, I have this burden of all these people complaining to me. This isn't what I bargained for. Verse 12. Did I conceive this entire people? Did I give birth to it? that you should say to me, carry it in your bosom the way a nurse carries a suckling to the land that you swore to its fathers? From where do I have flesh to give to this entire people? Moses is saying, from where do I have flesh to give to this whole people? Like, this is a lot of people, and where do I have flesh to give them? From where do I have flesh to give to this entire people, that they cry at me, saying, give us flesh, and let us eat? I am not able, I by myself, to carry this entire people, because it's too heavy for me. And if this is how you treat me, kill me if I found favor in your eyes, and let me not see my suffering. And Yahweh said to Moses, gather to me 70 men from Israel's elders, whom you've known because they're the people's elders and its officers, and you'll take them to the tent of meeting. This tent of meeting, by the way, in the e-source isn't described in the same way as the tabernacle is in the p-source. In the p-source, the tabernacle is in the center of the camp. This tent of meeting, which is basically the tabernacle in the e-source, is outside of the camp. And anyway, there are different things said about it than said about the tabernacle in the p-source. So take these elders to the tent of meeting, and they'll stand up there with you. And I'll come down and speak, and you shall say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you'll eat flesh, because you cried in Yahweh's ears, saying, who will feed us flesh? Because we had it good in Egypt. And Yahweh will give you flesh, and you'll eat. And you'll eat not for 1 day, and not for 2 days, and not for 5 days, and not 10 days, and not 20 days, until a month of days, until it will come out of your nose, and it will be a revulsion to you, because you rejected Yahweh, who was among you, and you cried in front of him, saying, why is this that we went out from Egypt? So this is what Yahweh is telling Moses to say to the people. Verse 21, and Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot, and you've said, I'll give them flesh, and they'll eat for a month of days. In other words, he's saying, look how many people there are, and you're saying that you're going to feed them all flesh? Verse 22, will flock or herd be slaughtered for them? Or would it provide for them? Or will all the sea's fish be gathered for them? And would it provide for them? In other words, he's implying here that they are not eating animal flesh from sacrificial meat or from the fish of the sea. So this text is clearly stating that the children of Israel were not eating flesh, not from the flock animals and herd animals being slaughtered, like it is in the P source, not from fish of the sea or from any other source. All they have is manna. And now he's saying, where are you going to get all these animals, Yahweh? This is what Moses is saying to Yahweh. Where are you going to get all these animals? Will you be able to feed all these people, even if you had flocks and herds to be slaughtered for them, even if you could gather all the fish of the sea? Verse 23, and Yahweh said to Moses, is Yahweh's hand getting short? Now you'll see if my word happens to you or not. And Moses went out and spoke Yahweh's words to the people, and he gathered 70 men from the people's elders, and he stood them around the tent. And Yahweh came down in a cloud and spoke to him, and took some of the spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 men of the elders. And I'm going to skip a little bit for sake of time, but it talks about the elders prophesying and Eldad and Medad prophesying as well. And then I'll skip ahead to verse 31. And a wind traveled from Yahweh and transported quails from the sea and left them on the camp, about a day's journey in one direction and about a day's journey in the other direction of the camp, and about 2 cubits on the face of the earth. And the people got up all that day and all night and all the next day and gathered the quail. The one who had the least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out, spreading around the camp. And the flesh was still between their teeth, not yet chewed, and Yahweh's anger flared at the people, and Yahweh struck at the people a very great strike. And he called that place's name Kibroth Hata'avah, because they buried the people who were craving there. Okay, so without commenting on whether this is historically accurate or whether it portrays Yahweh as loving or deceptive or what, this passage definitely has the tradition that the children of Israel were not sacrificing during their wilderness wandering, and that they were not eating meat during their wilderness wandering, and that when they complained about it, and Yahweh gave them meat, he was really opposed. He gave them the meat, but then he killed them for eating it. So this definitely portrays meat eating in a quite negative light. And anyway, kind of an interesting passage in the Pentateuch. And it shows that this tradition in Jeremiah of no sacrificial instruction and no sacrificing during the Exodus experience can be traced back not only 150 years before Jeremiah to the time of Amos, but it can even be traced back before that, possibly even as early as the late 10th century, if that's when the e-source was written. If not, then likely in the 9th century. Either way, this tradition definitely goes back a decent ways. So moving on from Amos and the idea of the Exodus as being a time without sacrifice and without flesh meat, let's look now to Micah. And with Micah, I want to show the same basic thing, that Micah was predominantly focused on morality. And in this focus on morality, he was correcting the predominant view of solving the problem of immorality, which most people viewed as being punished for immorality. And the way that they solved that was to offer a sacrifice of an animal. So let's see what Micah has to say, starting with Micah 2, verses 1 and 2. Alas, for those who devise wickedness and evil deeds on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it, because it is in their power. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance. Again, he's objecting to moral misconduct. For another instance of this, Micah 2, verses 8 to 11. But you rise up against my people as an enemy. You strip the robe from the peaceful, from those who pass by trustingly with no thought of war. So he's objecting to those who are doing these things, the ruling class of the people. The women of my people you drive out from their pleasant houses. From their young children you take away my glory forever. Arise and go, for this is no place to rest, because of uncleanness that destroys with a grievous destruction. If someone were to go about uttering empty falsehoods, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, such a one would be the preacher for this people. In other words, he's saying, you won't accept this rebuke against immorality, but if someone comes uttering falsehoods, saying, I'll preach to you of wine and strong drink, well, you'll listen to that person. Next, Micah 3. Again, this is showing the heavy concern for morality. And I said, listen, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people and the flesh off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin off them, break their bones in pieces, and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron. Then they will cry to Yahweh, but he will not answer them. He will hide his face from them at that time because they have acted wickedly. Thus says Yahweh concerning the prophets who lead my people astray, who cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against those who put nothing into their mouths. In other words, if someone feeds them, they'll prophesy good things to them, but those who don't give them any sustenance, they prophesy bad things to them. Basically, their prophecies are bought. Verse 6, therefore, it shall be night to you without vision, and darkness to you without revelation. The sun shall go down upon the prophets, and the day shall be black over them. The seers will be disgraced, and the diviners put to shame. They shall all cover their lips, for there is no answer from God. But as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of Yahweh, and with righteousness and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression, and to Israel his sin. Again, this is really focused on, look, I'm here to teach you righteousness and to rebuke sin. That's the message of Micah. Verse 9, hear this, you rulers of the house of Jacob and chiefs of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with wrong. Its rulers give judgment for a bribe. Its priests teach for a price. Its prophets give oracles for money. Yet they lean upon Yahweh and say, surely Yahweh is with us. No harm will come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded heap. Okay, so this is actually a prediction from Micah concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And this is given from Micah, who was prophesying 100 years before Jeremiah even. So Micah's prophecy certainly came to pass. Yes, it was over 100 years after he predicted it, but nevertheless, it did come to pass. And again, what is he rebuking? He's rebuking the idea that these people can go on and walk in sin and be unloving to each other and oppress each other, and yet they feel like Yahweh is satisfied with them because they go and offer sacrifice, but really they're doing wickedness. So Micah is objecting to that. Most clearly, Micah 6, verses 6 to 8. With what shall I come before Yahweh and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Again, all of that is part of the sacrificial system, depending on which source you have. The priestly source doesn't have human sacrifice. The source seems to. But, a lot of people, shall I bring burnt offerings and calves and thousands of rams? Most people would say, well, yeah, that's what God commanded. It's in the law. Micah is saying no. Verse 8, he has told you, O man, or O person, what is good. And what does Yahweh require of you? But to do righteousness and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. In other words, this is saying that God does not delight in all of these sacrifices and all that. This is not how to get good with God. Again, Micah does not have one positive thing to say about animal sacrifice throughout all of Micah. It's just rebuking people for wickedness. And then again here saying that offering all these sacrifices is not what God desires. What God desires from you is to do righteousness. So that's another example. Now, between the time of Amos and Micah was Hosea, and Hosea has a lot on this, and really probably the bulk of Hosea we're going to have to save for another time. But once again, Hosea doesn't have any positive thing to say about animal sacrifice at all. And Hosea has a heavy focus on righteousness and an even heavier focus than the others on truth and knowledge. And really a very interesting emphasis on truth and knowledge instead of sacrifice. Like, it really contrasts those two things. I'll just read one verse from Hosea, at least at the present time. It's Hosea 6:6, and it's Yahweh speaking, saying, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." This is before Jeremiah again. So remember, Micah was 100 years before Jeremiah. Hosea is before Micah, and then Amos is before Hosea. So you have Amos, and then Hosea, and then Micah, and then Jeremiah. Not to say that there are not others, but that's the order of the ones that we're talking about at the present time. And actually, I will read a couple other things from Hosea quickly. Hosea chapter 5, the end of verse 5, going into verse 6. Judah also stumbles with them, that is, with Israel. So this is talking about Judah now. With their flocks and herds, they shall go to seek Yahweh, but they will not find him. So it's like, okay, you have this whole thing of coming to offer sacrifice, but no, that's not going to be acceptable. And then later, Hosea says something very interesting, and we'll get back to this idea in a bit. Hosea 14, verse 2, it says, "Take your words with you and return to Yahweh. Say to him, take away all guilt, accept that which is good, and we will offer the fruit of our lips." This is really interesting. It's using sacrificial language, the language of offering and fruit, the produce, but it's the fruit of our lips. This is a very different type of offering. So Hosea, while opposing animal sacrifice, notice that he's saying to give something instead of animal sacrifice, and that is righteousness, as we saw in Hosea 6, verse 6, steadfast love or righteousness, faithfulness, and knowledge, and then also the fruit of the lips. So these things are all supposed to be the sacrifices that we are to give. In Hosea, there's also a rebuke of the priests for rejecting knowledge. In Hosea is where we get the phrase, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." And like right from the beginning, it's all about, there's no faithfulness, there's no knowledge. That's a heavy focus within Hosea. So we'll keep that in mind for later, this idea of kind of a whole nother type of sacrifice. There's another piece of Israelite literature that we want to take a look at. This is Psalm 51. And of course, being people who care to know truth based off of evidence rather than going with tradition, we cannot simply assume that this psalm was written by David. Most people take Psalm 51 as a Davidic psalm. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. We all think that was David, and we attribute it to David in connection with the Bathsheba experience. That's the traditional view, and that's what the little title within the Hebrew text indicates. However, that may not have actually been the case. This may not have been written by David. Scholars debate when this psalm was written. It's really all over the place. There's no scholarly consensus on when this psalm was written. And anything that I've looked at doesn't even evaluate the language of the psalm, like the stage of Hebrew. So maybe there's something somewhere where the stage of biblical Hebrew is evaluated, but anything that I've come across doesn't even evaluate that, which is a shame because that might be a far better indicator. Some argue that this psalm was written in a post-exilic period, after the exile. Some say it was during the exile. Some say it was before the exile. There is some argument that's given for it to be before the exile, which I find to be the best argument that I've heard so far, and I'll share it with you. Basically, most scholars agree that the last two verses of this psalm were added later, and the time at which it would have had to be added would be after the temple was destroyed. And if it was added after the temple was destroyed, then it's possible that the psalm was written before the temple was destroyed. And then there are themes in the psalm which are very similar to the prophets of the 8th century and 7th century and going into the time of Jeremiah. So some think that this was perhaps written at the end of the 7th century, something like that. Anyway, I'll read the psalm and you'll hear this same kind of idea that we've been reading through the prophets. Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. So this person is interested in morality. Verse 3, for I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Behold, I was born in guilt. In sin, my mother conceived me. Now, that could very well just refer to the sin of the mother. And he's just saying, look, I was conceived in iniquity. Maybe his mother was unfaithful or whatever. And so he was always surrounded in an environment of sin and thus led into sin. But again, he's talking about his own sin this whole time. Verse 6, you desire truth. So this is, again, the author of the psalm speaking to God and saying, you desire truth in the inward being. Therefore, teach me wisdom in my hidden thoughts. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain in me a willing spirit. Then I shall teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from bloodshed, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Notice here how, imagine this being said in the temple. There's all these priests sacrificing, and he's saying, if I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. I mean, think about this. How many times do you read in the Pentateuch, if you do this, go and offer this animal, and it will be a pleasing aroma to Yahweh, and Yahweh will be pleased, etc., etc., etc. And this is saying, if I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased, for you do not delight in sacrifice. The sacrifice that you accept is a broken spirit and a contrite heart. In other words, like, hey, actually being remorseful for sinning. So this, whoever wrote this psalm, and whenever it was written, it's definitely one of the instances among the writings of the Hebrews where someone understood that really God does not want animal sacrifice. God wants us to do righteousness. God wants us to change our way of thinking and thus our way of behaving. And again, this psalmist shared this idea with Hosea of another type of sacrifice, one that is not an animal sacrifice, but is a broken spirit. So we have to keep that in mind because we'll come back to that a little bit more. The next thing that we will look at is actually a couple of things from Isaiah, and we'll try to go through this pretty quickly because I know we've been on for a bit over an hour now, and it'd be nice not to carry this on for an exceedingly long time. Isaiah 56. This is the other passage which the synoptic gospels place onto the lips of Jesus in the temple cleansing incident. So he says, my Father said that this will be a house of prayer, yet you have made it a den of robbers or thieves. Well, the den of robbers part, that comes from Jeremiah 7. The house of prayer part comes from Isaiah 56. And we haven't really examined that much yet. Now, some things that I have to point out. Isaiah chapter 56 to 66 is considered by most critical scholars to be a separate writing from the other sections of Isaiah. So most scholars today divide Isaiah into three parts. Isaiah chapter 1 to 39 is called First Isaiah, and it is typically viewed as being predominantly composed of the writings of Isaiah, the 8th century prophet, often called Isaiah of Jerusalem. The Isaiah that we usually think of when we think of Isaiah. However, scholars also point out that there are certain parts of that section, Isaiah 1 to 39, that could not have been written by Isaiah because it's narrative texts about Isaiah, speaking of him in third person. Then there's another section, Isaiah 40 to 55. This is called Second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah, and it is understood to be a literary unit written by a single author, basically sometime during the days of Cyrus the Great. So this is coming right at the end of the Babylonian exile. And one of the reasons for this is because this prophecy speaks to Cyrus. It gives instruction to Cyrus and says, I have appointed Cyrus as my servant, and he shall do this. And then it gives instruction for Cyrus to do A, B, C. And when you read it, it doesn't come across like a future prediction. It's not like one day there will be a guy named Cyrus. It speaks of Cyrus as someone who already is in existence and who people know about. And it says that I have appointed Cyrus, things like that. So it seems to be speaking of Cyrus as an already existing person rather than someone else. Also, it's saying that Jerusalem will be rebuilt and the children of Judah will be gathered back to the land. That would be kind of a weird thing for Isaiah of Jerusalem to prophesy, since Isaiah lived at a time before Israel or Judah were scattered. So they're already in the land. There has been no exile. So how can you prophesy the return from exile when no one has been exiled yet? So this is why most scholars think, and probably correctly, that Isaiah 40 to 55, is a separate writing from the writings of Isaiah, the 8th century prophet, and it may in fact be the writings of another prophet who lived in the time of Cyrus. So that's another thing. And then Isaiah 56 to 66 is viewed as 3rd Isaiah, and some scholars think that it is a literary unit written by a single author. Others think that it's a compilation of different writings by different authors. I do not know the answer to that, but I'm just letting you know generally what scholars think about the book of Isaiah and how it's really 3 separate books, and how even each of those 3 books may not be a literary unit, so these are things to keep in mind. Anyway, this 3rd Isaiah, Isaiah 56 to 66, is often viewed as being written by some prophet living in Judea after the exile. So this is probably in the early Second Temple period, because some of what it says seems to assume that the audience are actually returned exiles. So it talks about those who are already gathered. It talks about different things in Jerusalem. It talks about the temple and sacrifice in the temple. It seems to assume those as present realities, and those sorts of discussions just aren't there in 2nd Isaiah. And since it talks about returning exiles, that seems different than 1st Isaiah. Thus, most view it as a 3rd Isaiah. So whatever it is, the Nazarenes, including Jesus, and also the pre-Jesus people of the line of truth, people like the teacher of righteousness and his followers, they were influenced by 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, and 3rd Isaiah. They were influenced by all of that. And I don't know whether Jesus viewed Isaiah as we now have it, as all being from Isaiah, the 8th century prophet, or whether he viewed it as being from different authors or what. In either case, it was these various Isaiah-type writings, or writings that we now consider to be Isaiah, were certainly influential and viewed as being inspired by the Holy Spirit by Jesus and his early followers. And it's not at all improbable that Isaiah 56 is something that Jesus had in mind, in addition to Jeremiah, when going into the temple. Now, there is some anti-sacrifice stuff in 3rd Isaiah, in Isaiah 66 in particular, which we will get back to. But Isaiah 56 has it has one passage that could be taken as pro-animal sacrifice, mingled with stuff that's not pro-animal sacrifice. So we'll read it and you'll see what I mean. So Isaiah 56, we'll read verses 1 to 8. Thus says Yahweh, maintain righteousness and do what is right, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance will be revealed. Happy is the person who does this, the one who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and refrains from doing any evil. Again, there's this moral focus. Do not let the foreigner joined to Yahweh say, Yahweh will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I'm just a dry tree. For thus says Yahweh, to those eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me, and who hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters, and I will give them an everlasting name that will not be cut off. And the foreigners who join themselves to Yahweh to minister to him, to love the name of Yahweh and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Now I want to pause here before continuing to point out that what it is saying here is contrary to some of the commands in the Pentateuch. Some of the commands in the Pentateuch command that eunuchs not be permitted into the house of Yahweh, and that foreigners not be permitted into the house of Yahweh, and that they cannot have the full rights of the covenant. So because they are foreigners, they are separate. Because they are eunuchs, they are separate. And this is saying, hey, don't allow the eunuchs to be saying this. It's implying that the eunuchs might be saying these things and that the foreigners might be saying these things because some of the Israelites are saying these things. Some of the Israelites are saying, no, you foreigners, sorry, you have to be separate. No, you eunuchs, sorry, you have to be separate. You can't really come to the house of Yahweh. You can't be a part of this. And this is Yahweh commanding the people through this Isaiah prophet, whoever he was, don't let the eunuchs and the foreigners be discouraged, thinking that they have to be separate and they're not welcome in my house. No, tell them that they are welcome. Tell them that whoever loves righteousness, whoever keeps my covenant, whoever does these things, they can be part of my people, they can be part of my house, and that's it. Now again, remember, that is contrary to some of the commands in the Pentateuch, but that's the message here, and clearly this is something that was carried on in the Nazarene movement. The Nazarene movement was all about this sort of thing. Anyone who does righteousness, and Paul especially emphasized this, that the people of God has always been defined according to the promise, not according to the flesh. In other words, the true Israel is always those who keep the covenant, those who are of the fleshly lineage of Abraham. If they break the covenant, if they do things that are wicked to Yahweh, Yahweh will not keep his covenant with them. This is the same thing that you read in Jeremiah and Hosea and Amos and Micah. Here they are doing all these things, thinking that they're being faithful to the covenant, keeping the covenant stipulations and sacrificing animals. And Yahweh is saying, look, I am not going to bless you in this. You will be scattered from the land. These are all the things that are Yahweh's side of the covenant. And Yahweh's like, no, I'm not going to bless you with these things, and I will divorce you. Hosea was the one who introduced that idea, and that was carried on through other prophets as well. The idea is you have to be faithful to the covenant. You have to depart from iniquity, and then you can be part of the people. And that's what this prophet, whoever he was, in Trito-Isaiah, is saying. And very welcoming to anyone who will keep the covenant, whether they're foreigners or eunuchs or whatever. And this is really a heavy focus on morality rather than other things. But then in verse 7, there's something else. Verse 7 again. These I will bring to my mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Now, most people viewed it as a house of sacrifice. The temple was a house of sacrifice. But this says, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. But then it says, their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. Now that comes across as pro-animal sacrifice. So we'll evaluate that in a minute. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Thus says the Lord Yahweh, who gathers the outcasts of Israel. I will gather others to them besides those already gathered. Okay, so this verse 8, when it says besides those already gathered, is one of the things that leads scholars to the conclusion that this is at a time after captives have already returned from the Babylonian exile, and he's promising that I'll bring more back besides these. Because really, some are back, but they're not really enjoying the fullness of the covenant. Okay, so here's the thing. What's going on in this passage? Isaiah 56 verse 7 is the only passage in Trito-Isaiah which comes across as pro-animal sacrifice. And really, there is one element that does make it seem pro-sacrifice, and that is the fact that these words, burnt offerings and sacrifices, typically indicate animal sacrifice. However, there are at least 4 elements that would lead one to the conclusion that maybe this isn't referring to animal sacrifice. The first is the heavy focus in this verse itself on the temple being called a house of prayer. Like, why make that major emphasis? And these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. And then in the last part of the verse, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. Well, why? Like, why in this context call it a house of prayer? Well, maybe it's trying to indicate that what they are doing in the house is praying. I mean, that would be a good reason to call it a house of prayer. So if that's the case, and really it's a house of prayer rather than a house of sacrifice, then maybe their so-called burnt offerings and sacrifices are not actually animal sacrifices. That's one thing that might indicate that. The next reason, or the next aspect that might indicate that really these are not animal sacrifices, is the fact that this verse says that the reason why these offerings are accepted is because the house is a house of prayer. I'll read it again. Verse 7. These, so these people, foreigners and eunuchs, I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar for, or because, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. So in other words, these burnt offerings and sacrifices are accepted because the house is a house of prayer. Now, how does that make sense? That the reason why they're accepted is because the house is a house of prayer. Well, if the phrase house of prayer is to indicate that what they are doing in the house is praying, then it's saying that the reason why these offerings will be accepted is because it's a place where people are praying. That would seem to indicate that really the burnt offerings and the sacrifices are actually prayers. So that's kind of interesting. The reason why these offerings are accepted according to this verse is because it's called a house of prayer. Now, actually, I realized just now that there are at least 5 reasons, not just 4, and we'll make this new reason 3. The third reason why this may not, in fact, indicate animal sacrifice is because the word for burnt offering actually doesn't indicate burning at all. In fact, if I was to do a translation of the Bible, I would not use the phrase burnt offering. The word is Allah or Olah in Hebrew, and it has to do with ascending, something going up. And in fact, even the word to go up to Jerusalem is Aliyah. It's connected to this Allah idea. And a better translation of this is an ascent offering, something ascending up. And yes, that could be the smoke of an animal sacrifice, but it could be something else, like your voice or your prayers or whatever, ascending upwards. So the word itself does not necessitate an animal being slain. So that's one reason that someone might have. Again, the words are usually used to refer to animal sacrifice, but the words themselves do not require animal sacrifice. A fourth reason is that if this writing, Isaiah 56, is actually from the same author as Isaiah 66, then certainly the author was opposed to animal sacrifice. Again, this one is an if, because I don't know whether third Isaiah, if third Isaiah really is third Isaiah, I don't know if it is a literary unit or if it is a compilation of different writings by different authors. That's something that's debated among scholars, and it's something which I have not personally investigated. However, I will say that I read Isaiah 56 to 66 earlier today, and whether it's written by different people or the same person, there is certainly a continuity of themes. Like, it really does emphasize the same points over and over again, and there seems to be a logical progression of thoughts from chapter 56 to 66, and it kind of starts and ends in the same place. 56 talks about sacrifice and temple and Sabbath, and 66 talks about sacrifice and temple and Sabbath. And they both seem, or they both at least could be read to talk about sacrifice in different ways. Oh, and the other thing is they talk about inclusion of people other than Israelites within the temple system and all of that. So they are really talking about the same issues, yes, in slightly different ways. But, reading it all the way from 56 to 66, I can certainly see how it could all be written by the same person, because, again, it's the same ideas, and it has a logical progression, and it kind of comes back to the same ideas at the very end. And Isaiah 66 definitely opposes animal sacrifice. I'll read the first 4 verses. Thus says Yahweh, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me, and what is my resting place? All these things my hand has made, and so all these things are mine, says Yahweh. But this is the one to whom I will look, to the humble and contrite in spirit, who trembles at my word. Whoever sacrifices an ox is like one who kills a human being. Whoever sacrifices a lamb is like one who breaks a dog's neck. Whoever presents a grain offering, like one who offers swine's blood. Whoever makes a memorial offering of frankincense is like one who blesses an idol. These have chosen their own ways, and in their abominations they take delight. I also will choose to mock them and bring upon them what they fear. Because when I called, no one answered. When I spoke, they did not listen, but they did what was evil in my sight and chose what did not please me. Okay, now this passage is one of the clearest passages opposing animal sacrifice. Now, I will say that it has been slightly altered to make it not against animal sacrifice. In the Masoretic text, in verse 3, where it says, whoever slaughters an ox is like one who kills a human being, the word like, in Hebrew, it's just one letter. And in the Masoretic text, it was removed. So in the Masoretic text, it says, whoever slaughters an ox kills a human. Now, that's not equating slaughtering an ox or sacrificing a lamb with killing a human and breaking a dog's neck. In the Masoretic text, it's just simply saying that the one who does these sacrifices does these wicked things, which could be read as just, hey, the priests are being bad. The priests are murderers, and the priests are people who killed dogs, breaking dogs' necks and stuff like that. That's not condemning the activity of animal sacrifice. That's condemning priests for doing other things that are bad. But the Septuagint and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Isaiah Scroll 1Q, Isaiah A, so you have both Hebrew and Greek witnesses that are generally more reliable traditions in these cases than what you find in the Masoretic text, preserve the older reading, which is, whoever slaughters an ox is like one who kills a human being. Whoever sacrifices a lamb is like one who breaks a dog's neck. That is condemning the act of ritually slaughtering oxes and lambs to being equivalent to killing a human being and killing a dog. This is saying that Yahweh views the actual killing of an ox as being as morally reprehensible as the killing of a human. So this is really setting it high. offering a grain offering, it says that it's like offering swine's blood. So this is, not saying it's the same as killing something, although offering swine's blood, you'd think it would involve killing, although there are ways to draw aside from actually killing the animal. So this is like a little bit less of a condemnation. It's not coming across as so bad, but still something that any Israelite, even if they were pro-sacrifice, would recognize, like, oh, offering swine's blood, that's bad. Whoever makes a memorial offering of frankincense is like one who blesses an idol. Well, blessing an idol isn't like killing someone, but it's still really bad and obviously operating under many, many misconceptions. So this is really strong condemnation of the priestly system that you find, for example, in Leviticus. And also it really points to a heavenly sanctuary. Now, third Isaiah isn't totally opposed to a temple. Again, it has the house of prayer in Isaiah 56. And it's clearly supposed to be a house of prayer in Jerusalem. So it's not saying that there's no place for an earthly temple. Just like Jesus didn't say that there was no place for an earthly temple. He, in fact, wanted to rebuild the temple in a different way. Jeremiah said that Yahweh wanted to dwell in the temple, but wanted them to stop all the wickedness in order for him to be able to do so. Throughout these prophets, there's not an opposition to the temple through any of these writings, nor an opposition to Sabbath or festivals as a whole. Isaiah 66, the same passage, later talks about coming and worshiping before Yahweh on Sabbath and new moon. But it's definitely opposing animal sacrifice. And later in Isaiah 66, when it talks about the Sabbath and new moons, it talks about another kind of sacrifice. Isaiah 66:20 says, "They shall bring all your kindred from all nations as an offering to Yahweh." So it's talking about bringing people as an offering. Again, this is another type of offering. Oh, also, I'll say the only thing that you find here in contrast in the early part of Isaiah 66, notice it's opposing animal sacrifice very, very overtly. And just before that, it says, "But this is the one to whom I will look, to the humble and contrite in spirit, who trembles at my word." That seems to be based off of Psalm 51, verses 16 and 17, where it says the sacrifice that Yahweh accepts is a broken heart and a contrite spirit. It's the same thing here. So it seems to be saying this is what Yahweh wants. Yahweh wants us to be remorseful for our sin, to turn from it and do righteousness, and not to slaughter animals. That reminds me, by the way, there's one thing I was going to mention when discussing Psalm 51, which I did not mention, and that is the two verses at the end, verses 18 and 19 in most Bibles. The last two verses of the Psalm have been added, and it's a de-radicalization. It says, I'll go back to it and actually read it so you can hear it. "Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar." This is right after saying, "For you will have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give you a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." So these two verses at the end were added, overtly promoting animal sacrifice in order to de-radicalize Psalm 51. Very interesting. And by the way, further evidence that those two verses were added is the fact that 1 Clement, chapter 18, quotes the whole psalm, but without verses 18 and 19. So you have a quotation of the psalm not including those verses. Again, most scholars think that those verses were added upon other grounds than that, but it's an interesting fact. So anyway, in Isaiah, what we have in this third Isaiah is that Isaiah 66 overtly speaks against animal sacrifice for overtly moral reasons. It's saying that this is as bad as killing people and breaking dogs' necks. In other words, this is an issue of animal rights. It's an issue of humane treatment of animals. So that's what's going on in Isaiah 66. And Isaiah 66, just like Hosea, just like Psalm 51, has another type of offering that it advocates. And it advocates a humble and contrite spirit. So again, if Isaiah 56 is from the same author as Isaiah 66, then the burnt offering and sacrifice that will be acceptable, or more accurately, the ascending offering and the sacrifice that's acceptable, cannot be animal sacrifice. And the fifth reason, or the fifth aspect that might indicate that the ascent offering and sacrifice in Isaiah 56 verse 7 that is acceptable to Yahweh is not an animal sacrifice, is the fact that sacrificial language is used to refer to things other than animal sacrifice in the time before, during, and after the time of 3rd Isaiah. So all the way back at the end of the 8th century BCE, there's Psalm 141 that talks about prayer using sacrificial language. So this is before 3rd Isaiah. Psalm 141 verse 2 says, "Let my prayers be set before you as incense, the lifting up of my palms as the evening offering." Okay, so here you can have kind of sacrificial language being used for prayer and calling out to Yahweh. And again, most scholars would date this psalm to the end of the 8th century BC. Then there's Psalm 51, which again some would say is maybe the end of the 7th century BCE. And in verse 17 it says, "The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." So this actually uses the word sacrifice, just like we find in Isaiah 56 verse 7, to refer to being remorseful for sin, not an animal sacrifice. And in fact, as we have already seen, Psalm 51 is opposed to animal sacrifice. Another psalm, which most scholars would date to the end of the 7th century BCE, is Psalm 119. And in verse 108, it says, "Please accept the free will offering of my mouth, O Yahweh, and teach me your statutes." So it's another type of offering, but it's of the mouth. Just like Hosea said, we will offer the fruit of our lips. We have that same sort of different type of offering being spoken of. Now let's go a little bit after 3rd Isaiah. There's a collection of writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls known as Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. Scholars debate whether this is something that came from the early period of the Qumran sectarians, as they're sometimes called, or if it comes from before their time. The reason why it's debated is because there were copies of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice found outside of Qumran. There were copies found at Masada. And that could be because people at Masada also had these songs and believed it, even though they were not of the same sect of Jews as the Qumran Jews. Alternatively, it could be that a Jew from Qumran fled Qumran when the Romans came and made it to Masada and brought a copy of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice with him or her. In either case, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice were probably written sometime in the 3rd century BC or the 2nd century BC. It certainly couldn't be after that. And they speak of another type of offering. And really, it's focused on these 7 heavenly sanctuaries and a heavenly priesthood offering heavenly offerings. And there are no animal sacrifices described in this text. However, there is another type of offering, another type of sacrifice. So I'll read different lines here. This is from 4Q 403, column 1, around line 40. Sing to the God of power with an offering of the princely spirit, a song of divine joy. So music here is being described as an offering. And if you go back to our studies on sacred songs, you will find other references beyond what we're going through today, describing music as being offerings and sacrifices. Later, 4Q 403, also column 1, fragment 2, line 13 or so. And all the ornaments of the innermost sanctuary burst into wonderful prayers in the innermost sanctuary. This is all described in terms of ritual and, kind of heavenly sanctuary priestly law, and it's prayers rather than animal sacrifices. Later, from the same fragment, line 26, it says, the offering of their tongue, the 7 mysteries of knowledge and the wonderful mystery of the 7 domains of the Holy of Holies, etc., etc. There are more examples that could be given, but it's talking about the offering of their tongues rather than the offering of animal sacrifices. Also, we will read from the community rule as well, just to give this idea of another type of offering, another type of sacrifice. 1QS column 9, line 4 till line 7. They shall atone for guilty rebellion and for sins of unfaithfulness, that they may obtain loving kindness for the land without the flesh of holocausts and the fat of sacrifices. A prayer rightly offered shall be as an acceptable fragrance of righteousness, and perfection of way as a delectable free will offering. At that time, the men of the community shall set apart a house of holiness in order that it may be united to the most holy things, and a house of community for Israel, for those who walk in perfection. Okay, so here it's explicitly stating no flesh of holocausts or sacrifices, ascent offerings, no fat of sacrifices, but instead prayers and perfection of way. Later, the hymn at the end of 1QS, and this hymn also, by the way, is found in the Thanksgiving hymns and is written by the teacher of righteousness. It says, he shall bless him with the offering of the lips at the times ordained by him. Again, the offering of the lips, not the offering of animal sacrifice. Later, in this same hymn at the end of 1QS, I will bless him with the offering that proceeds from my lips. And then the Thanksgiving hymns contain a lot more of this sort of language, these sorts of sacrifices and offerings that are not animal sacrifices. And this is, again, from the teacher of righteousness, but we won't take the time to read all that now. Also, I will mention, going further beyond these ancient prophets, we have this same sort of language occur in the writings of the Nazarenes that we're all familiar with. We know in Romans 15, verses 15 and 16, Paul says that he is a priest. He says that he serves the gospel of God as a priest so that the Gentiles may become an acceptable offering. Well, that's based off of Isaiah 66. He says to present your bodies as a sacrifice in Romans 12. 1 Peter 2:5 talks about being a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices. The epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 13, verses 15 and 16, talks about offering a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of the lips, and to do good and share what you have are characterized as pleasing sacrifices to God. 2 Timothy 4:6, either Paul or pseudo-Paul, if Paul didn't actually write it, talks about being poured out as an offering. Philippians 2:17, Paul is saying, I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith. Philippians also talks about people sending financial offerings as being a type of sacrifice. And then 1 Corinthians 9 talks about the Lord's Supper as being a type of a sacrifice. So does 1 Corinthians 10 and 11. So we have this thing kind of present all throughout the writings of the Nazarenes. And I'm not going to go through all the examples, but you guys are familiar with our studies on it, A Change in the Priesthood, A Change in the Law, both the tract and also the YouTube studies that we have by the same title. All of this shows a different type of priesthood, one in which there are sacrifices that are not animal sacrifices. Now, we'll come back to this as it relates to the Nazarenes in a moment, but as it relates to Isaiah 56, again, to summarize this, in Isaiah 56, verse 7, it says, regarding the faithful, truth-loving foreigners and eunuchs, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings or their ascent offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Now, there's one reason that one might give for interpreting that to refer to animal sacrifices, and that's the fact that the phrase burnt offering and sacrifice, those phrases are usually used to refer to animal sacrifices. However, there are at least 5 reasons for suggesting that in this passage, the phrase ascent offerings and sacrifices does not refer to animal sacrifices. The first is that the context is characterizing the temple not as a place of sacrifice, but instead as a place of prayer. The second is that the reason why these sacrifices are accepted is because it's a house of prayer, according to this verse. In other words, the actual reason why they are acceptable is because it's a house of prayer. That seems to strongly indicate that really these sacrifices are sacrifices of prayer rather than sacrifices of animals. The third reason for thinking that this passage is not describing animal sacrifices, but another type of sacrifice, is simply that while it is true that these phrases are usually used to refer to animal sacrifice, the phrases themselves do not actually indicate the killing of an animal. And in fact, of course, burnt offering is not really good translation. Ascent offering is a much better translation. A fourth reason for understanding this verse to not be referring to animal sacrifice, but to another type of sacrifice, is a conditional reason, but it is that if 3rd Isaiah is a unity, if the author of Isaiah 56 is the same as the author of 66, then that author was definitely opposed to animal sacrifice. And this author definitely speaks of sacrifices as being something else other than animal sacrifice. So Isaiah 66 verse 20 talks about bringing Gentiles to Yahweh as making an offering to Yahweh. And talks about Yahweh accepting, like Yahweh would accept a sacrifice, contrition of heart. That's, again, in Isaiah 66. So Isaiah 66 uses language of sacrifice for things other than animal sacrifice, and it contrasts it with animal sacrifice and condemns animal sacrifice while promoting these non-animal sacrifices. So again, if Isaiah 66 and Isaiah 56 were written by the same author, that really pushes it beyond doubt that Isaiah 56 is not advocating animal sacrifice and that the ascent offerings and sacrifices there cannot be animal sacrifices. And the fifth reason for thinking that the burnt offerings and sacrifices in Isaiah 56 verse 7 are not referring to animal sacrifices is the fact that sacrificial language is used to refer to other types of sacrifice from at least as early as the 8th century BCE all the way up until the time of the Nazarenes. So this may very well be doing the same. So again, that's all Isaiah on its own. Now let's go to the Nazarene interpretation of it and beyond. Certainly in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus' citation of Isaiah 56, if that's historically accurate, that Isaiah 56 influenced Jesus' action in the temple, then certainly Jesus understood Isaiah 56 to not be promoting animal sacrifice, because Jesus was there opposing it, as we've seen in our previous studies. And again, he's citing it in terms of the idea of the house of prayer. But now we want to make some further observations on how this whole subject impacts how we look at the Nazarene movement and their view of sacrifice. So first, it's worth noting that the Nazarenes, in opposing animal sacrifice, were not just following the tradition of one prophet, Jeremiah. They were following the tradition of Amos, Hosea, Micah, Jeremiah, whoever wrote Psalm 51, whoever wrote at least sections of 3rd Isaiah, whoever wrote the community rule. They were following the footsteps of the teacher of righteousness. They were following in the footsteps of all these people who came before them within the Israelite tradition, who were presenting something other than animal sacrifice as being the correct way of sacrificing and the correct way of worshiping Yahweh. Now, another thing that I must add is that we can know for sure, historically, that Jesus was influenced by the prophecy of Malachi, and we have talked about this in recent studies. Jesus viewed Malachi as containing a job description for John the Baptist and a job description for himself, and certainly it must have influenced Jesus' view of the priesthood and sacrifice and the sanctuary. And it's very interesting how when reading Malachi, it's not opposed to the Levitical priesthood, but it definitely views the Levitical priesthood as having become corrupt and as having originally supposed to be rather different. I'm going to read to you Malachi 2, verses 1 to 9. And now, O priests, this command is for you. If you will not listen, if you will not lay it to heart to give glory to my name, says Yahweh of hosts, then I will send the curse on you, and I will curse your blessing. Indeed, I have already cursed them, because you do not lay it to heart. I will rebuke your offspring and spread dung on your faces, the dung of your offerings, and I will put you out of my presence. Know then that I have sent this command to you, that my covenant with Levi may hold, says Yahweh of hosts. My covenant with him was a covenant of life and well-being, which I gave him. This called for reverence, and he revered me and stood in awe of my name. True instruction was in his mouth, and no wrong was found on his lips. He walked with me in integrity and uprightness, and he turned many from iniquity. For the lips of a priest should guard knowledge, and people should seek instruction from his mouth, for he is the messenger of Yahweh of hosts. But you have turned aside from the way. You have caused many to stumble by your instruction. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, says Yahweh of hosts. And so I make you despised and abased before all the people, inasmuch as you have not kept my ways, but have shown partiality in your instruction. Okay, so this is Malachi. This is writing in the Second Temple period, and he is clearly saying that God had made a covenant with the Levites. But how is this covenant described? It's saying that Levi was supposed to be a teacher of truth. All these things that it's saying Levi was supposed to do, it's all about what's found on Levi's lips. Teaching knowledge, guarding knowledge, giving instruction to the people. They were supposed to be able to go to Levi to learn truth, etc., etc., etc. Learn the ways of righteousness and integrity and uprightness. That's what it was supposed to be. That's where people were supposed to go to learn of these wonderful things from Levi. But Levi perverted the covenant. And the rebuke here and the threat here in Malachi is, if you do not listen to this rebuke, then I will curse you. I say this to you so that my covenant with Levi may hold. That's implying that if the Levites listened to the rebuke through Malachi, then the covenant with Levi would hold. That also implies that if the Levites did not listen to this rebuke given through Malachi, then the Levitical covenant would come to an end. Then in the next chapter in Malachi 3, it talks about sending my messenger to the temple. This is where Jesus and John the Baptist come in. They came in as these messengers, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it actually makes it plural their coming, not who can endure the day of his coming, but who can endure the day of their coming. And then again in Malachi 3 about offering offerings of righteousness, not animal offerings, but offering righteousness instead, just like in the community rule. Now, Jesus, we can show historically that Jesus understood himself and John the Baptist to be fulfilling this role in Malachi. This means that Jesus believed that now the Levitical covenant was broken. Their period of probation to listen to the reform advocated by Malachi was up, and they didn't do it. And now it's time to institute a new priesthood. So a change in the priesthood, a change in the law, right? Like, we're familiar with this. But what we need to learn now is that the priesthood that Jesus was advocating, while it was a change in the priesthood, and while it was no longer to be a Levitical priesthood now, it was open for all, the way that this priesthood was to be conducted is not some new thing. The way of being priest was really what the teacher of righteousness and what the author of Isaiah or authors of Isaiah, what the author of Psalm 51, what Jeremiah, what Micah, what Hosea, what Amos, what all these guys were saying all along. The way that all these prophets were advocating for the priesthood to be carried out and their opposition to animal sacrifice. That's the way that Jesus was advocating for the priesthood to be conducted. So yes, he was instituting a new priesthood, but the way of doing the priesthood is really how the old priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, should have been doing it all along. Furthermore, it is important to realize one of the things that we showed in the booklet, A Change in the Priesthood, A Change in the Law, is that Jesus was really bringing in this new priesthood during his earthly ministry. And in doing so, he actually was not trying to institute the priesthood of him being the high priest in the heavenly sanctuary and bleeding in front of wicked gods. How can we know that that's not the priesthood he was trying to institute? Because he wasn't planning on dying. And he didn't have to die. People could have accepted him. So really, the priesthood that he was trying to institute during his whole ministry wasn't precisely the same as the priesthood that ended up being instituted after his ascension. The priesthood that came about after his ascension was actually something different. That was a change of plans. And actually, really, you can trace it back even before the ascension to the Last Supper. The Last Supper has Jesus instituting the bread and the wine. Now, if the bread and the wine, if it's correct, as we have in Paul's writings and in the Synoptic Gospels, we have multiple independent attestation for this. There really seems to be every reason to think that this is correct. It seems to be that just before Jesus died, he knew that he was going to get killed. And he instituted the emblems of the bread and the wine to teach us the lessons of the crucifixion. To teach us the lessons that we're supposed to learn from his death. In other words, he was making it about the lesson before the event even took place. But that, Ellen White talks about how the Last Supper is the transition between two economies, which I think is correct. But then how do you explain all this stuff that Jesus was doing in discarding the Levitical priesthood and opposing animal sacrifice and all of that, and instituting a new priestly system prior to the Last Supper and prior to the crucifixion? Well, it's because he was trying to bring about a new priesthood even then, but there seems to be a change of plan that took place because of the realization that he was actually being rejected. If all went as Jesus planned, then he wouldn't have died. He would have brought an end to animal sacrifice. The temple, as it was in Jerusalem, would have been destroyed and rebuilt to be a house of prayer for all people. And the priests of the new priesthood that he was introducing would be priests of righteousness, and it wouldn't be exclusively children of Aaron, and it wouldn't be exclusively children of Levi. And there would have been offerings brought to Jerusalem from all around the world. And these offerings would not be animal sacrifices. They would be people being brought to the truth. That's how it would have been if things went according to Jesus' plan. So Jesus' plan for a new priesthood was not actually him in the heavenly sanctuary bleeding. It was actually him on earth in an earthly temple that was connected to the heavenly temple, and it would have been a house of prayer for all people. So this is really showing us, though, that while Jesus was instituting a new priesthood, the way that the priesthood that he was instituting was to conduct itself was really the same as how the priesthood was supposed to be conducting itself all along, according to Malachi and Micah and Hosea and Jeremiah and Amos and all these other prophets. So I think that the message that our Heavenly Family has been giving through these prophets, at least as far back as the 8th century BCE, is a beautiful message. And our Heavenly Family really does and has had a priesthood in mind this whole time. They really do want us to be priests. And they really have despised animal sacrifice this whole time. And they want us to be priests doing something better than that. And it's all about teaching truth. And I'm sure there's more to learn in connection with it. But anyway, that's the end of what our Heavenly Family gave to me to present to you guys today.
Amen. Beautiful.
Amen. So we have been on for quite a long time. I'm thinking that we'll bring an end to this meeting. If there are comments and questions, there are always future meetings and also Facebook. So with all this said, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family in ending the meeting?
I'll pray. Heavenly Family, thank you for the opportunity to meet again together on this new moon, and we thank you so much for the new material that you've given us, and we're so thankful to know that you are not a God that desired animal sacrifice. It makes so much sense to us, and we just thank you for all these revelations that you give us each month. Pray that you'll be with us as we go our separate ways. Help us to study even more, that we might know all the truth that you would have for us. And we ask all these things in the name of your Son and daughter, Blessed.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, love you all so much, and I hope that you have a great rest of your new moon, and let's proclaim truth and do priesthood the right way. So shalom.
Shalom. Thank you. Shame.